Hi, and welcome to this Lernard.com video on installing Ubuntu as a virtual machine on Virtualbox. I'd like to begin by making the point I made in the previous chapter again, which is that DevOps tools primarily run on Linux servers. They can be used to help with both Windows and Linux deployments, whether that code is made using .NET or Java or anything else you fancy, but almost always you'll find the tools themselves are actually installed on Linux boxes. In fact, as time goes on, I expect this preference for using Linux to become even more prevalent, as big players like Microsoft are slowly focusing all their efforts on trying to get cloud revenue from people, rather than selling operating systems. This is great news for us DevOps engineers, as that's where we're going to be making our money. But it does mean we need to focus on our Linux skills from day one in this course. If you're already running Ubuntu or another brand of Linux on your laptop or your desktop, then good for you. You can skip this section and move on to the next one. For the rest of us though, we're probably using either a Windows or an Apple computer, and so we're going to need to install Linux somewhere else. To achieve this, we're going to run Linux in something called a virtual machine. Put simply, for anyone who doesn't know, a virtual machine allows you to run multiple operating systems at the same time on just one computer. I go into some real tech detail about how this is achieved in my chapter on Docker, but all we need to know for the moment is that whether we're running Windows or Mac, we can also run Linux at the same time. So there's no need to go out and buy a second computer or spin anything up in the cloud. We can save our money for better things. I've chosen to use Ubuntu for these courses because it's a well-known distribution that works straight out of the box. But if you've got another favourite distro you want to use, please go ahead and use that instead. So, let's get started. You can see here that at the moment I'm on a Windows desktop. This is the only time in these courses that I'll be openly using a Windows desktop, as the rest of the lessons are taught directly from the Ubuntu desktop we're about to install. It doesn't matter if you're using an Apple laptop instead of Windows, as the steps will be almost exactly the same, so you'll still be able to follow along. As I said, we're going to be running our Ubuntu desktop as a virtual machine in Oracle Virtualbox. So first, we need to visit the Oracle website to download and install Virtualbox itself. Open your browser of choice here. And once the browser is open, let's type Virtualbox. And as you can see, the download link is the first hit on search. There's options for both Windows and Mac here, as you can see, and as I'm on Windows 10, I'm going to select the Windows option. I've actually already downloaded one of these, so if I just go to my Downloads folder, we can see it there. Let's double click on that and accept the warning from Windows here, and now we get a classic installer screen. This may be slightly different visually on a Mac, but the options are going to be pretty much the same, and we're not going to deviate far from the default in any case. So, next. And then we can just accept the default features to be installed, so next again. And I'm happy for it to create desktop and start icons, but select whichever of these most suits your needs, and then next once more. This next box is a warning that the install will cause a brief drop in network connectivity, so if you've got any huge downloads going, you might want to pause them before selecting yes here. And now we're done and ready to install. I'll just fast forward this here. And now on Windows virtual machines, we also need to confirm that we want the virtual USB device to be installed, which we do. And there we go, all finished and Virtualbox is now ready to launch. Let's do that now and take a look at what it looks like. Beautiful. Just as we discussed in the introduction, Virtualbox is a piece of software that allows you to run multiple operating systems on one computer, using a technology called virtualization. In our case, we're looking to run a copy of Ubuntu desktop in this Windows 10 machine, so the first thing I need to do is click New up here to add a new virtual machine. I'm going to give it the name Ubuntu, and because I've done that, Virtualbox has automatically detected that here the operating system I intend to run is Ubuntu Linux, and has adjusted the type to match Linux and the version to be Ubuntu. Let's click Next, and now we're being asked to choose the amount of memory our virtual machine will be given. I'm assuming you're all familiar with the concept of RAM, and as a virtual machine acts like a tiny separate computer, it has its own pool of RAM that we give it from the main pool of your laptop or desktop. How much memory you choose to give your virtual machine will depend on how much memory your laptop has to offer, and just as with real computers, the more you give it, the better it will run, at least up to a point. In my case, I'm going to start with a rather stingy 2 gig here. We can always change this and up it later if we don't give it enough, but I think Ubuntu won't even run properly with less than that. Next, Virtualbox is asking us how much storage we want to give the virtual machine we're creating. We just want to use the default here of create virtual hard disk to make a new piece of storage, and click Create. The default of VDI is fine here too. This next option is an interesting one common to all virtual machines, the idea of dynamic allocation, which means that VirtualBox will only use the storage on your host machine if it's in use by the VM. So, if you give it 100 gigabytes of storage, but it only uses 10, it will only use 10 on the base disk, that being the disk of your laptop in this case. This can be quite useful, but bear in mind that if you do dynamically allocate, you need to make sure that you don't run out of space on the host that the VM then tries to use. I used to work with a lot of big VMware farms back in the day, and over-provisioning storage was always one of the classic ways that people managed to mess up their farms. But I digress. Let's choose Dynamic and click Next. And now we've got an opportunity to name the disk and to give it a size. And as we won't be using much space, I'll just stick with the default 10 gigabytes. And now we can click Create. Great, it's created the machine, and now we can see it here in our virtual machines list. At the moment, this is just a blank disk with some memory and CPU though. VirtualBox doesn't actually install the operating system for us. We need to go and do that ourselves. To do that, let's right-click here and choose Settings. This menu is a list of all the things we can alter on this machine, including the things we just defined, like memory during the setup. Browse down to the Storage option here and select the Empty CD option under the IDE controller. Just like with a real computer, we can simulate the act of putting a CD into the drive of our virtual computer, in this case by selecting it as a pre-downloaded ISO file. You can see here VirtualBox is suggesting Ubuntu for me, but that's just because this isn't really the first time I've done this. But in your case, you'll need to browse to the file here like this. I haven't recorded myself downloading this file, as all you have to do is type in download Ubuntu desktop and it'll be the first hit. Though I recommend you do choose Ubuntu if you want to follow these lessons exactly, there are lots of other different feasible flavours of Linux you could choose, called distributions, with loads of other great choices like Fedora, CentOS, Debian or Arch. So if you're a fan of a different distro, feel free to download that one instead of Ubuntu, and I'm sure you'll still be able to follow along just fine. Right, now we've put our virtual CD into our virtual drive, we're ready to start our virtual machine. So let's select OK here, right-click the virtual machine again, and this time choose Start, then Normal Start. Doing this opens a window where we can see our new operating system booting from the ISO image we attached to the virtual CD drive. It's a bit easier to imagine what we mean by a virtual machine now that we can actually see the second operating system booting inside a separate window on our laptop. All the steps from here on in this lesson will just be covering the setting up and installing of Ubuntu. So if you're familiar with what it feels like to install Linux, please feel free to skip ahead to the next section. If this is new to you though, then let's take a look at some of the options. I'll select English here, and then click Install Ubuntu. Try would just boot into a temporary version you can use to play around with, but we want a permanent one. I'm going to choose English UK here. These settings mainly affect keyboard layout and regional variations of spelling, so just select whichever suits you. Next, let's choose Normal Installation here, which just dictates how many extra bits you'd like, such as editors, office software and utilities. We want to perform updates while installing, but we're not going to bother with third-party drivers as we're not currently using any, so we can leave that unchecked. The nice thing about virtual machines is that they usually start with a blank drive like the one we just created, so we can just choose Erase Disk and install Ubuntu here. Don't worry about erasing data on your laptop. This is only going to erase the disk we created for the VM, which has nothing on it in any case, it's just a blank holder. And that's it. We can now click Install here to install our Ubuntu desktop. We're happy with these settings, so I'm going to click Continue again. And now, while Ubuntu is installing, we'll get the opportunity to configure some extra bits. So first, I'm going to indicate that I'm in London, UK here. And now we can enter our user details, give the computer a name, and set our password. There we go. And now that's all done, I'm going to use an extreme fast forward so you don't have to wait around and watch this install. In your case, this could take anything up to half an hour or more depending on the speed of your system, so it could be a good time for a cup of tea. Great, it's done. Let's choose Restart here. And now you can see Ubuntu is asking us to remove the installation media. In our case, that means the ISO we attached to the virtual CD drive. So let's jump back to our settings and deselect that to ensure Ubuntu boots into our installed instance. There we go. Here we can see it booting up, and now we're presented with a login screen for the user we created, so that install is complete. I won't dwell on this any longer, but I think it was worth just quickly covering this, as not all of you will have played with virtual machines before, and I'm sure a lot of you will have come from Windows backgrounds and haven't installed Ubuntu before. Not the most interesting of chapters though. So without further ado, let's move on to the next section, where we look at those two most important of concepts, Git and version control. Hopefully see you there.